Hi everybody, it's Cash. Welcome back. Thank you very much for joining me. Today I want to show you the transition pictures for Pontius Pilate, who was the Roman governor of Judea, appointed by Emperor Tiberius from around 26 AD to 36 AD. And obviously he was the one who ordered the crucifixion of Jesus. I assume the Romans would pronounce it Pontius Pilate, not Pontius the way we tend to, but very little is known about this guy, either before he became governor or after he left the post. He was a noted anti-Semite, apparently. He would crucify Jews around Jerusalem all the time. But, of course, Jesus was a rebel and a threat to Roman rule after his followers declared him to be the king of the Jews. And so he had to be crucified as well. Pontius Pilate eventually left the post of governor because he subdued an uprising a little too violently and was recalled to Rome to stand trial. By that point, the old emperor Tiberius had died, I think, replaced by Emperor Caligula, who wasn't terribly interested in addressing issues from the previous regime. So nobody knows what happened to Pontius Pilate. Did he languish in jail? Did he commit suicide? That's a popular speculation. Nobody has a clue. In fact, there's so little known about this guy. Was he married? Nobody really knows. Did he come from a wealthy family? Nobody really knows. Was he good? Was he evil? Not sure. How did he die? Was it suicide? Nobody really knows. But I thought I would do his transition pictures to see if they gave any clues. And they did, which is fascinating. But first, before I get to those, I also tried to do one of our little time travel experiments, the way we do, to go back to 33 AD. And see if I could get a flavour for the kind of times they were and see what pictures came. Now, the problem with doing these kinds of pictures is that I've seen movies that depict those times. I've seen TV shows. I've seen paintings. So there was a great danger of cross-contamination there. But I simply opened myself up to see what came. And it was really, really interesting. Initially, I was sitting on the ground, and I was very dazed, and I felt dehydrated. Lost, maybe? Over here, to my left, there were rocky outcrops, which could be hills, mountains, or something, but there was rocks over there, and then a wall over here surrounding a town or city. And for some reason, I couldn't go in there. There was a gate, a doorway, but I couldn't go in. And maybe I had sunstroke, maybe I was dehydrated, but I just sat on the ground, unable to move. As I watched, somebody, I assume a guard, came out of the doorway, out of the gate of the city, carrying I guess it was a spear, a pole or something, and walked towards me. And I still didn't get up. I still stayed on the ground. I think I was really, really weak. It felt as though I was either an evacuee or I was on the run. I was fleeing something. Maybe there'd been some kind of battle or purge or something. I was running away. But I was completely depleted and an alien to the group of people who were inside the walls. And this guard came over and asked me what I wanted. And I must have explained that I'd run from somewhere or was fleeing something, and I needed water and food. The guard didn't have either and went back inside the city. But I got the feeling the fact that I wasn't killed with this spear or whatever meant that it was a tacit invitation to follow him. My kind of person, whatever I represented to the people inside the city, was not liked necessarily. Because when I asked for water, there was water there. Somebody came from the crowd with water. But instead of just letting me drink it, they threw it in my face. Because I remember, one, the insult of that, but two, taking it with my hands off my face and feeding it into my mouth. So desperate was I for fluids. And the people just laughed. It was a joke to them. To me, it was life or death. And I went and stood in the shade while I took the water off my face and my neck or whatever and put it in my mouth. The city had lots of these sinewy little alleyways in it. Now, again, I'm a little bit bothered by cross-contamination here because I have been to Israel. I have been to these towns and cities and seen what they're like. But that's what I saw. It was very tightly constructed streets with obviously no windows or anything, but they had holes in the walls. And I went up to one and looked in through it, and there were women inside, and they saw me and invited me in. It felt like they were being compassionate to somebody who might otherwise be shunned. That's what that felt like. And they gave me a cot to sit on and gave me food and drink. I don't know about the length of time here, but it felt that once they'd done that, they had to get rid of me. I was a pariah for some reason in this city. And I was led, not out of the front way, but out of the back of the building, down a tiny little alleyway, and they said goodbye. So I was just standing there, and I was overlooking a plain. There was a steep drop, and then there was desert or sand or something there, and there were people down there. And I couldn't get down. I had to make a left along the top of this sort of mini cliff thing, and went back into the city again over here. And I wandered around because I now had food and drink inside me and I was strengthened. I walked around and came to a doorway. And when I walked into the doorway, I looked up and it was like a tower. There was a tower above me, like a bell tower. In fact, I think it was a bell tower that had the bell missing. There was no bell, but it was a bell tower. And the interesting thing about this tower, this building, was that it had alcoves in the walls, as if there'd been windows there at one point, and they'd been bricked up, which of course isn't the case, but that's what they looked like. And somehow I got up to one and sat there. And I couldn't be seen from the ground, I don't think. So you could walk into this bell tower at the bottom, the ground level, and look up and not see a guy sleeping on a ledge halfway up the walls. There must have been some way up there. I don't know how I got up there. But that's where I slept. And that became my home. Now, it stopped there, but I thought that was particularly interesting. It wasn't in any way significant. It didn't feel. I was just a regular kind of poor person who was found in the desert having fled something. But it was so odd to feel, as I felt the whole time, that life could end at any minute. That was the norm. And it was such a contrast to how we feel right now. We feel relatively safe from day to day, that we're going to be okay, probably. But the whole time I was going through those streets, I felt like somebody could end my life in the next 10 minutes and it wouldn't matter. And I almost expected it. There was no sanctity of life at that point. Just people were people, and you kill them if you needed to, and so on. And if you didn't like them, you kill them. And I wasn't liked. I was shunned. I was despised for some reason. So that was my little time travel experience in that time around when Jesus was crucified. But going back to Pontius Pilate, when I went into his energy, bearing in mind nothing is really known about him at all, when I went into his energy, I was halfway down a rocky face or some kind, and there were spikes sticking out of it. I don't think literally, just metaphorically. There were spikes sticking out of it, and he was face down, lying on these spikes. It was almost like he was melting through them like cheese. They were supporting him, but barely. My guess is that he was seriously ill. He wasn't languishing in shame the way some historians would have us believe. He was dying of some kind of illness that was eating away at his body. Almost cancerous, maybe. Because as I watched, his body began to fragment because of the spikes, and he fell the rest of the way in pieces and landed really roughly. So there must have been great pain here at the very end, because he landed at the bottom in a very, very disheveled state. And he was tiny in what seemed like a gigantic environment. And when people are tiny in the transition pictures, it usually serves as a reminder that they're only great in their own head. And in fact, in the order of things, they are small and insignificant. Maybe that's how he felt at the end, that those 10 years of being governor were his best years. And once he'd been taken away and demoted and put on trial, all his illusions about himself were shattered. But this wasn't even like the normal tunnel I see. It felt more like a drainage channel, like he was being flushed away. You know, in movies when they have those dank underground passageways and you can hear water dripping. You don't see it, but you can hear water plip, plip, plopping in the background. It's a bit like that. It felt like he was human waste, effluent, metaphorically speaking. I don't think this was shame about having the Son of God crucified. I don't think it was that. This felt like a deterioration at the mental level, like self-flagellation, like he didn't deserve to be alive. And his sense of self was gradually getting smaller and smaller and less significant. And he got up and he walked along somehow, and there was a very large dip that he had to go into and climb out of. So these are the final throes of his death. It must have been painful. It must have involved some kind of delusionary state and self-torture in a way, maybe a fever dream type thing. And then there was some final spasm of the body that he had to go through before his complete expiry. But he did arrive on his knees in that cave that I always see. But what was so interesting was that this time the floor of this cave was sloping. It was very hard for him to get his balance. So I do think that he was mentally disturbed by the end. His mind was not right. He wasn't thinking straight. Everything was overwhelming. And he tortured himself over maybe what he'd done with regard to Jesus. Some people say he became a Christian after he had Jesus crucified. In fact, there are whole religions based on that idea. But I'm not too sure that's true. Christianity didn't really gain any kind of traction for a long while after. Jesus wasn't starting a religion. He was simply preaching certain principles that would help people. But in these pictures, the floor was sloping. Pontius Pilate's consciousness seemed incredibly disoriented, and it felt like he was beating himself up. But I don't know that he had the mental capacity to do that at the consciousness level. He just seemed out of it, and nothing was right. He wasn't stable, and he was just at the mercy of his environment. And going up the tunnel, which everybody does towards the light that I usually see at the end, was incredibly arduous. This was a beaten man, ironically. This was a depleted man, a demoralized man. The ruthlessness and bloodlust he'd had during his mortal life was really just an ego thing. And now that that was over, he didn't have anything to empower him. His power came from his authority, I assume, and it felt so lonely. Nobody's here with me. Nobody cares about me. I am nothing. Everything came from his authority, and when that was taken away from him, he was substantially diminished as a human being. And this was all arduous. It was so tiring to get up this tunnel. And when he got to the top of the tunnel, to that cave that I always see, which is metaphorical, of course, there is no real cave, but that cave that I always see with the dome of light in it, where people enter in order to ascend, he just collapsed to the ground in the pictures. Again, depleted. A broken spirit, a broken man. It was the most ignominious end for somebody who is a significant figure in human history. And I guess it's the power of grace, in the end, that takes us the rest of the way. I've seen this in several sets of transition pictures. It's almost like there's a final energy that comes forward to help the helpless. Because when I went into that particular moment of his transition, it felt like somebody had me on a rug or a length of strong curtain and was pulling me into the light. There's nothing I had to do, nothing I could do, other than submit, yield, and allow grace to show the unconditional love that we know exists during this process. Come on, allow us to nourish you at a soul and spiritual level. Rather like in the time travel pictures, rather like the women who offered that man food and drink when he was reviled by everybody and desperate. It felt the same kind of desperation, really, but at a spiritual level. Allow me to embrace you, nourish you, and guide you back to the light. Guide you back to where you belong. Come on. But up until that point, this was one of the most anguished transitions I've ever experienced. It was torture, but self-torture. The whole thing was a bundle of distress and disempowerment. But not because necessarily of what he'd done to the Jews or Jesus or whatever, but simply because that was the kind of guy he was. Without his power, without his authority, without that sense of being important and having dominion over people at the mortal level, he was nothing. When that was stripped away, he had nothing left and went into a spiral so fast that it could have brought on illness. And ultimately, that kind of level of depression and self-flagellation could have killed him at the physical level. That's what that felt like. And that's it. Those were the transition pictures for Pontius Pilate. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.